Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. They've left me alone again. It keeps happening. Must be my deodorant. But this time I've dragged Beth with me. So Beth, morning. How are you doing?
Hi, Chris. Yes, I'm good. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm surviving. But who have we got on today? What are we chatting about?
Yeah, so we've got something a little bit different for you guys today. We're going to be talking about historical fiction. So our guest today is Anika Scott, who's a journalist and novelist. Her previous books include The German Heiress and Soviet Sisters, and she's here today to talk about her new book, Sinners of Starlight City. Hi, Anika. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
We've been chatting quite a bit about email over the last couple of days on this subject, and it's we're going to be talking about the 1933 Chicago World Fair, aren't we?
Yep, that is one of the most fascinating environments and topics. And I think very few people kind of realize what all these amazing factors that came together in history in one place. So that's what we'll kind of dig into today.
So I'd only heard of one World Fair before, but that was only linked to the serial killer who was murdering visitors. But what can you tell us about any of the previous World Fairs and what they're all about?
Yeah, I mean, in general, the World's Fairs were created just to kind of highlight the advancements that people had made in technology, also culturally, architecturally. So you might remember the Crystal Palace, in London. These were all kind of World's Fair things to demonstrate how many advancements, the mankind in general or people had made. So, they jumped around to different countries, and different places could highlight what they were doing special. So, for instance, at one of the famous World's Fairs, Krupp, the German steel works and weapons manufacturing people demonstrated their huge cannons. And I even think that was at the same fair in London, if I recall, where the Crystal Palace had been built. And, so you have this contrast between beautiful architecture, amazing kind of, demonstrating things like telephones, telegraphs, things that were new at the time. And then you have weaponry. I mean, you might have this really big line of amazing, but sometimes disturbing things that a World's Fair would show people who came to visit. And so the fair that you'd mentioned before, where the serial killer had been, that was also in Chicago. That was in 1893. And I absolutely recommend anybody interested in World's Fairs to read Erik Larson's Devil in the White City. That was, my favorite book about that World's Fair, a nonfiction book about a World's Fair, and that is where a serial killer had been operating sort of on the outskirts of the fair. And it was also an inspiration for the book that I wrote.
No, we're so excited to delve into all this with you. And so we're going to talk in depth about the Chicago World Fair specifically, as we mentioned. And just thinking about this era, the 1930s, the 1920s, a time of huge change as well, post the First World War. 1930s and 20s, we're seeing the rise of particular nationalist regimes. So there's a huge amount going on at that time. So can you kind of talk us through what the challenges were at the time of this 1933 World Fair for Chicago hosting? What was kind of going on domestically, economically? What kind of, things did they have to kind of bear in mind as they were trying to create this event?
Yeah, it was one of those projects you can imagine that takes years to plan. So when Chicago decided that it wanted to host the World's Fair in the United States, it was still the 1920s, before the stock market crash, which was 1929. So when they were planning the fair, they thought they might have the money, and that was the Jazz Age, the time when everybody thought they were getting rich. So in 1929, when the stock market crashed, the world fell into the Great Depression, and so that was not the greatest time to plan something that people didn't know if it would make any money. It was going to cost money. So the organizers of the fair had to do a lot of convincing. And this ends up being one of the first World's Fairs that was driven by companies instead of by the country itself. So the United States didn't necessarily say, we are going to fund the World's Fair in Chicago. Chicago had to go ask General Electric or any of these other big companies that existed at the time and said, are you going to come to the fair, show, build pavilions and show people stuff and sell things, what you do at a fair? And in that way, we can fund it, because that was the only way that they could pay these costs. So that was actually an innovation that happened at that time, and that is one of the reasons that so many of these big companies at the time had built pavilions at the fair. And then the other problem was, of course, that almost all the countries in the world were poor, right then. It was after World War I, Europe had been so swallowed up in blood and in wars. Even when the Jazz Age came, people recovered somewhat. It was still a relatively poor time for most people. And certainly when the Depression hit, the worldwide economic crisis, the countries that Chicago went to and said, please, can you come and build a pavilion at our World's Fair? They're like, no, we're not going to do that. So a lot of the international pavilions that Chicago ended up building were done also by individuals who were interested in certain countries, or people who had collections of things from certain countries because they traveled. And once that started, then sometimes the country itself, we could say maybe Japan or somewhere, a country itself would come and then add to it, so that there ended up being, this international feel to the fair. But it was unofficial in the sense that many countries themselves, as governments, didn't participate. But Italy was one of them. They were a big exception. They were really big behind the fair, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, because Mussolini, he'd been in power for about 11-ish years by that point, and wanted to show off Italy. He manipulates sort of the tech there as a sort of a propaganda tool, doesn't he?
Yeah, it was such a fascinating and disturbing time, really. I think when you look at kind of the early years of nationalism and fascism, Italy was the flagship country for fascism. Of course, so Mussolini had a lot of time to develop the image of the country that he wanted the world to see. And the World's Fair in Chicago ended up being a very good vehicle for Italy to show itself as modern and futuristic and, sort of a global power instead of what Italy actually was at the time. After World War I, Italy had fought on the Allied side. And they had expected to sort of get more of the spoils of war than they actually did once the Allied side won and Germany was defeated. So Italy was actually a bit, miffed by that. They were and their pride was hurt. So the part of the role of the fascists at the time was to build up this kind of national pride. And that was something that they wanted to do not only within Italy, but for Italians around the world. And the United States had at the time and still has a very large population of Italians. There were so many that emigrated, including part of my family, that emigrated to the United States from parts of Italy. And they ended up in the cities. Chicago, in particular, was a city with lots of Italians there. And so the World's Fair ended up being a kind of thread that the fascist government in Italy saw that they could reach out to their sort of, fellow Italians who were in the United States, and then also use the fair as a vehicle to show the entire world, what sort of country they say anyway Italy had become. And so they went all in kind of manipulating how Italy was to be seen by the world. Italy was one of the countries that sent, I don't know if it was the most exhibits to the fair, but they sent hundreds of different exhibits to the fair to demonstrate technological advances by Marconi and others, in Italy. And air travel in particular was a very new, very exciting thing in the 1930s. And that is the biggest thing that Italy was able to do at the fair, was connect Mussolini himself and Italy, fascist Italy, to the exciting advances happening in air travel.
And that ties really well into our next question, because as you're saying, these events offered such an opportunity for fascist regimes to show a demonstration of technology, of power. And so we're thinking about Germany now, because, obviously there are examples such as later on in the 30s, the infamous spectacle and hosting of the Olympics by Nazi Germany. So, they would go on to hold such propaganda, events as part of major European and world occasions. So kind of why was Germany not involved in the Chicago Fair? It'd be interesting to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, Germany was in a lot more turmoil at the time, and I live in Germany now, and I've been here a long time, and I've gotten the opportunity to learn so much history and some of the real problems that they had here at that time. So after World War I, there was almost Civil War type violence happening in Germany. And the Weimar Republic, the first democratic government in Germany, was maybe not as weak as people tend to call it later, but it was on unstable ground because there were so many forces that wanted it to fail. So obviously the biggest force that wanted it to fail was the Nazi Party. And at the time that the World's Fair was being planned by Chicago, Germany just was not in a condition to be able to send money or any kind of investment into something like that. Germany was still paying reparations. In the late 1920s, it was actually occupied by France and along the western part of Germany, and so it just wasn't economically capable of doing much. And in 1933 itself, when that rolled around, I think we can all recall that is when the Nazi Party got majority power in the parliament, in the sense that then Hitler could be appointed chancellor. And that was very fresh. That was very, very new. So when the World's Fair opened, Hitler had been chancellor, I think, a few months. And Germany did not have an official presence at the fair in 1933 in the way that Mussolini's Italy did. But Nazi Germany was watching Italy. Nazi Germany learned so much from fascist Italy. I think now when we look back, people see Hitler first and then Mussolini, but it was actually the other way around, right? I mean, Hitler had to learn, and Mussolini had already had, over a decade to cement his power, and also to demonstrate how do you present your country to the world, this new, because at the time, what the fascists thought they had as an advantage is that they're new. They're not part of the old systems. And a lot of people wanted that. They wanted something new. So how do you use propaganda? How do you use the new technologies like radio, like movies, and then also things like, airplanes, technology, that sort of thing, in order to show the world that the fascists are a new thing, creating a new society with new people, new kinds of people. So, Nazi Germany did not have the opportunity to show that at the World's Fair because Germany was just getting on its feet. Nazi Germany, I should say, was just getting on its feet and had not consolidated enough to be able to do that. But like you said, by the Olympics, in 1936, they were ready. Then they had that big stage that they could present themselves to the world on. But in 1933, it was still Italy at the front, and they did it at the fair.
The 1936 Olympics and the World Fair, though, was that they did send Graf Zeppelin, which was quite a demonstration of German power.
Yeah, they did that towards the end of the fair. In 33. That was the fair was open for about 4 months, I'd say, from May to about the 1st of November. So over the summer of 1933, the fair was open, and the Zeppelin, I think, showed up in about October. So that was, it gave it a little time, but Germany then ended up sending that. There was also a very big, it's not funny in a funny sense, but amusing anecdote that there was a sort of pavilion or place where Germany had some exhibits, or at least there were German exhibits. And there was a fight between people who wanted to raise the swastika flag and the people who wanted to raise the sort of democratic Germany flag. And that was actually a real thing happening, that people were for and against it. There were, kind of fisticuffs about it out in the fair and media about it. So the controversy of Nazi Germany was there, certainly there. And then when the Zeppelin came, that was absolutely sort of a show. I feel it's almost like a premonition sort of the sort of power that they were going to claim, that Nazi Germany was going to claim, over the world anyway. And so it was quite a symbolic thing, but it wasn't more than that at the time, to have the Zeppelin with the swastika on the side over the World's Fair. But at the time, in 1933, people didn't have the same sensibilities to these symbols as we do now. They were still new, and people would sing a fascist song or raise their arm in the fascist salute, and sometimes not even think about what that meant. So it was a very, in a way, it was more naive time in the sense that people just didn't have the experience that we have now.
I can just remember the fair started, and after about a month, there was a meeting in Berlin with, well, look what Italy's doing. We've got to do something. What can we do? We could send a Zeppelin. Done. That'll take 5 minutes. Get it in the air. Go.
Yeah, I mean, it's, to me, I feel like maybe I'm overstretching, but it feels like sometimes Hitler and Mussolini, that there was some jealousy on the part of Hitler of what Mussolini and what fascist Italy was able to achieve. So certainly, what Italy ended up doing was sending a squadron of seaplanes, it ended up being 24 seaplanes that flew in formation across the North Atlantic from Italy, over Europe, over the North Atlantic, over Canada, to Chicago, to the World's Fair. And at the time, this was a big deal. It was a huge deal. Basically, the entire world was watching this. And this was the era of people doing these dramatic air flights. We have Amelia Earhart, we have, Lindbergh, and all that kind of fascination, the public fascination with air travel and with flight. And the fact that Italy was the country that did this, and not Germany, I bet I was kind of galling to the Germans at the time. And so the Zeppelin was sort of maybe an answer to that.
What can we do on the fly?
Yeah.
So what kind of exhibits were they showing at the fair in 33?
There were everything you can think of. I think that the more fun exhibits had to do with, in a way, the things that people could interact with. And they were not always the kinds of things that we would think are appropriate today. But at the time, people thought it was interesting. So, for instance, there was an army camp or something that resembled an army camp, where they had tents and they would have, the soldiers on horseback still, riding around. And there was a part of that where they had like a Native American camp also, where Native Americans would show people how to do various crafts and how to make various things or traditions. And, looking at that today, that definitely feels on the edge of exploitation of people. At the time, at least by the sources that I had been able to read, people were actually quite proud to be able to show, what traditions they had or whatever it might be that they were able to show. So there were those sorts of exhibits. There were also lots about medicine. There were just a lot of advances in medicine at the time. And so some of them were, I didn't know about myself until I had started kind of researching that. For instance, what they were, advances in cardiology, what they were able to do with heart surgery even back then. And so there were, I believe, every day or every other day, there were just lectures that they would give on various kinds of medical advancements. People were extremely interested in that. And one of the big ones there was the incubators where premature babies were kept until they were big enough to leave on their own. This was another one of those exhibits that walked that line between, yes, we want to know what amazing advances in medicine that the world now has, and also they're exhibiting babies, at the fair. So people would pay 25 cents and walk in and see through a glass window incubators, these sort of metallic, they were metal glass boxes, and the babies themselves might be put in a little like a sofa or something where they were kind of laying there bundled up, and people could just sort of walk by and look at them. And what I was learning about them, it made me think of social media and how some people put their babies out there for everybody to see. So it's not unheard of for that to happen even now. But back then it was done with this idea that, we want people to know what the world is capable of doing, and that these children are worth saving. Before the pediatrics were more advanced, people just thought if a kid was born early and they can't live, well, that's it. That's God's will. And the children were called, weaklings, that they just shouldn't live. So it was actually a battle for the doctors and nurses to convince some people that these babies deserve to live. And look, we can do it. It takes a lot of resources to save these babies, but it can be done. And so that was part of what the World's Fair, not only in Chicago, but many different World's Fairs did when they put these premature babies on display. So that was one of the more popular exhibits that was at that Chicago Fair.
No, that's something I was never aware of with this fair or the others. I mean, as you say, many of them, or perhaps all of them, there's all these things you can look at and those ethical questions of who they were putting on display. But yeah, I hadn't heard about the premature babies before. Moving on to another kind of display part of the fair, and talking about women's roles in the fairs and women on display as such, specifically. The Chicago 1933 fair included burlesque dancers, for example. Could you tell us a little bit about that and women being, on display for the fair and the kind of questions and problematics around that?
Yeah, that was one of the most surprising things when I was researching the fair for my book. I actually didn't realize that the main character I was writing was going to be a burlesque dancer until I started reading about them. It was completely fascinating. I can just use an example. The premier dancer at the Chicago Fair was a woman named Sally Rand. And she had been sort of a minor actress, performer, dancer before that. And she became famous by basically dressing up, is the wrong term, as Lady Godiva. She on a white horse and riding into the fair without being invited. She just did it. Got on a white horse, basically naked, rode into the fair to its opening night party, so that all the important people who were at the fair that night saw who she was. They said, "We've got to hire this woman right now." And she had then basically she made the most money at the fair of any other woman, and she was just an amazing person to begin with. She negotiated her contracts. She made sure that she got what she wanted out of this work. And she was became famous for a fan dance, these big feathered fans, and they dance and kind of hide themselves and are all very seductive and sort of this peekaboo. So she didn't strip tease. She just came out in sometimes it was almost like a bodysuit, but so sheer that you couldn't, in the lighting, it looked like the dancers were nude. And then she would dance with these fans, and later with sort of big bubbles or balls that look like bubbles. And, but she was a good dancer too. So it wasn't just sort of cheap entertainment in that sense. It was, these are women who are talented. They're good at what they do. And they know how to use their sensuality and how to use their bodies in the way that they choose. And that really was the difference between someone being exploited, obviously, is someone who is forced to use their body. And these women, the different dancers at the fair who chose the work, there weren't many options, obviously, for women's work, unless you were especially lucky or talented or had a lot of money. But within this sphere of the arts that these women did, they were, able to become famous in that. And so my favorite dancer from the World's Fair was called Little Egypt. She is, or was at the 1933 fair, she was over 60 years old. And when I learned about her, I thought, my goodness, what? But this was a woman who still did what was the belly dance, at her age. And, I am not quite that old yet, but I still don't think I could belly dance very well, so it was really amazing that she did this. And she was became famous at Chicago's first World's Fair, at the 1893 World's Fair, the one with the serial killer story around it. She became famous as a young woman dancing the belly dance at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. She returned 40 years later in 1933 to the World's Fair to sort of reprise her show. And her fans came, and I just thought that was the most wonderful thing ever when you think about how a woman could have a career like that. And they made a movie about her later, in the 1950s. So the World's Fair was able to, to give a platform to or a stage to these women who really took that, were able to take that power and use it for themselves. And they were, they had their enemies, of course, because American society is prudish in a way. Chicago wasn't. And this was still sort of, the spirit of the Jazz Age was still there in the sense that, people themselves still loved, the sort of naughty, dancing and the wildness. But the society in general, there were people who got these dancers arrested. They were pulled out of the fair. They were fined repeatedly. I don't remember how many times Sally Rand was arrested in that summer, but I think it was multiple times she was arrested. So, and every time the judge would say fine, $25 fine, and don't go on stage nude anymore. And the dancers would be like, yeah, okay, fine. And then they would go back to the fair and do their shows the way they wanted to. So this was just such a fascinating environment and such a fascinating group of women. And I ended up, wanting to write a story where the main character was really one of these strong women from that world. And that's where I got the main character for Sinners of Starlight City.
No, it's so important to assert their own individual agency as well as highlight what was going on in society and the views of society and at the fair. And I imagine what you're saying about the fining there, I mean, $25, I imagine she was making a lot more than that at the show, surely.
Oh, yeah. The exact number, I cannot remember what the exact number was, but I'm pretty sure it was something like she was one of the higher paid people, and it was at least something like $90 or $100 a week, which at the time would have been a lot for, certainly for a woman. And so, the fines that they gave these women, I don't think they were quite a slap on the wrist. It was certainly money, but it was not, these were misdemeanors. These were not big, felonies or anything. But what was so fun is that how the women, they in a way ridiculed the kind of prudish society around them. So I think there was one situation where the women were told not to come on stage nude, and then they went on stage after that wearing kind of ridiculous bloomers and just stuff that was so utterly absurd that the audience was like, come on, don't do that. And so in a way the spirit of fun and the audience, the demand, was much more important than the prudes that wanted to stop the women from doing what they did.
Talking of fun stopping, the only vice I have left is the occasional drink, so I can't imagine living through Prohibition. But that was still sort of rolling on as well. How did the World Fair? I mean, if you want, especially in England, if you want people to come in and go, we have a bar. So the idea, was it dry?
Yeah, it basically was. What was happening is Prohibition was coming to an end. The United States had basically changed its laws so that alcohol, even beer, was illegal, and that had really, really given organized crime a big boost. So Chicago in particular was known for organized crime. The business of producing and selling beer and harder alcohol was, made fortunes. Al Capone, they made their fortunes with beer during Prohibition. But the United States was sick of it by the end. Everybody would go to the speakeasies and drink anyway. So at some point, the country said, look, this is not going to work. But each state had to then ratify repealing the laws. so the laws that had forbidden alcohol were being repealed, but it was sort of happening slowly, you could say. So at the time, everybody knew prohibition was almost over, but the laws were still in effect when the World's Fair opened in 1933. So what they did was they still had beer gardens, and they might not have called it a beer garden, but that's basically what it was, and these various nightclubs and things. I'm sure there was illegal alcohol flowing through that place, of course, but officially, people would be served this kind of near beer, this like the kind of low alcohol, beer. I think I don't know exactly how, how low, but, that's what they did, was they had this sort of ersatz beer that people sort of pretended to be okay with. But interestingly enough, the Chicago World's Fair was so popular and so successful that it ended up opening again the following summer in 1934, and that was when Prohibition was gone. So then they were really able to serve all the fun drinks that people would want. In 33, though, there was still that sort of spirit of the speakeasy still. And in particular, one part of the World's Fair, which was called the Streets of Paris, was sort of a rebuilt Parisian, sort of a marketplace kind of look to it. And that's where the nightclubs were. And that's where kind of the action was, or one of the places where the action was at night at the World's Fair, because some people would just come in the evening just to party, basically, in 1933. So they were bringing in their kind of secret bottles of things, and that gave the fair in 33 that feeling that there was still this sort of secrecy, flowing underneath it, that the whole kind of speakeasy jazz age prohibition time had, but everybody knew it was about to end. So it was all a little bit more relaxed than it had been before.
And returning to the spectacle of the fair and its reception, I mean, this was in terms of, as we talked about, the exhibits, but also the architecture. Slight diversion, but I was in Seville earlier in the year, and one of the places I went to was the Plaza de España, which is a gorgeous, really grand square building fountain, which was built for a fair, for an exhibition that was being hosted there. I mean, so thinking about what Chicago did for their fair in 1933, and the kind of architecture they may have had. I mean, what did the Chicago residents actually think of all this? The architecture that was created, the exhibits, the feel of the fair. What was the general reception of the event?
It was just overwhelmingly well received, and I think even the people who planned it were very pleasantly surprised. The architecture at the time was totally fascinating. I really love that era's they wanted to move away from the kind of classic or federal Roman, neo-Roman looking buildings. But they wanted to demonstrate a kind of modern, sleek city. And Chicago had burned down, or at least a lot of it had burned down in the late 19th century, and they had rebuilt it into a very modern city. And Chicago had some of the first skyscrapers. And so this was the image of a new American city, basically. Is what also the fair was there to reflect. So the buildings were very sleek, very modern. You'd have these big cavernous halls filled with the exhibits, and they had it was almost like a robot looking statues, and just the look of it was, at the time, so very modern for people. And then on top of that, the technology of the fair, was, blended with the architecture. And so they called it, or they wanted to call it, the Rainbow City. And they did that to show that this Chicago Fair was different than the White City, which was the Chicago Fair 40 years before, where everything looked, kind of a Snow White, classical, old-fashioned for us looking city. This was going to be new, modern, colorful. And, what they did was they had these beams and bars of light that would shine on the buildings or off the buildings at night, so that, there's postcards and artwork that you can see of the 1933 fair that demonstrates this. Obviously, the photographs can't show it, but the artwork does. And these bars of color, the way that the color was, they would have outdoor fountains that are just have color just springing from them. And if you think about the time period, we still have black and white movies, black and white, photographs, and so on, using color in the way that the 1933 fair did on top of the architecture that was built, these sleek buildings, these, with, when you combine those two together, then that was something that was actually quite revolutionary in a visual sense for most people. And if you think of the United States at the time, a lot of people coming into Chicago at that time, that might be the biggest city they've seen ever. If they've come in from the countryside or from other states, and then to walk into this space of modernity and color, it was. I tried to get across this feeling in the book, this feeling of magic and of this is a place unlike anything they've ever seen. And that was what the organizers of the fair were really going for. That effect of you are in a magical place, almost, I won't call it a utopia. They tried to call it that sometimes, but even now when we look back at some of the buildings or the photographs of the World's Fair, they look very familiar to us, even now, 100 or almost 100 years later, because of how modern it was.
So moving away from the fair, though, you were inspired by your own family history to help create your main character. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. The main character, her name is Rosa Mancuso, and she is part Sicilian and part Black or African American. And her family, her Italian side of the family are an immigrant family that went from Sicily to the United States in the early 20th century or late 19th century. And that's very much like my own family. So during the pandemic, I'm sitting here in Europe. My family is sitting in the United States, and I couldn't go home. I have my kids here. And so it was just an opportunity for me to think a lot about family in general. I just started talking to my mom in particular, and other family members about just family stories, how people were doing. And that really unlocked something in me where sort of naturally these stories started to flow into the character I was creating for the book. And so I didn't know it, when I started that was how it was going to be. But, when thinking about the family in the early 20th century, families that are immigrant families or families that are mixtures of some kind, from different nationalities, different languages, different races, whatever it is. The United States in particular was a place where there was so much movement going on, so many people coming together, that there are any story you could think of, somebody has that background, and I think I missed the fact that there aren't really any stories about families that are like mine, or at least there are very few family stories like that. And so, I was able to talk to my family and get a lot of information about both sides of my family, what happened within my mother's Italian family, over time, how my family relates to me. My family's been great with me. I'm not from a sort of tragic background, the way my character is, but I was able to ask a lot of questions about, how did my grandparents see my mother and my father when they were together? What happened? What did people say? Things like that I hadn't really asked in the past about my own family. And that flowed into the story. And I think that the Italian side of it came out so strongly, partly because I knew I was writing a book about the World's Fair, about the 1933 fair. I was fascinated by Italy's role at the fair. And once I kind of was thinking of the main character, I thought, my God, I already have that connection to Italy. I have it in my own family. And so then it was a matter of kind of developing the story so that my main character's connection to Italy and this air armada, these pilots that flew from Italy to the United States, would be a sort of natural connection within the story, and involving a sort of family story that leads to the World's Fair in the end, and it leads to what ends up being a big revenge story, that has all of the hallmarks of a sort of, I won't call it Shakespearean story, but you have betrayal and murder and family strife and tragedy, and all of that sort of that story coming together at the World's Fair, and it was natural because my family story was already, that thread was already there, and I was able to connect it with the Italian story at the fair.
All the hooks for a great fiction story set against an amazing historical event.
Yeah, I believe that. I totally believe that. I have, obviously I read a lot in historical fiction. Sinners of Starlight City is my third book. So, I've been writing, in different not time periods, but in different countries in particular. And every time there's got to be that core of something true. For me, that has to be the case. I love historical fiction of any kind. So if it's just a period piece, people living their lives in the past, that's fine too. It doesn't have to be based on a true event. But I feel that gives that story such a grounding, such an anchor in the real world when you have an event like the World's Fair, like these pilots that Mussolini sent to Chicago. When you can give a story that kind of core truth, then it makes it very exciting to sort of build the fictional aspect of that world around it. I'm not a person who likes to write real historical people in the sense that, my characters are fictional. Mostly. In my second book, which was a lot of it was in the Soviet Union, I had Khrushchev, for instance, in some of the scenes, and every word out of his mouth in my book were things that he had actually said. And so that's a different kind of writing to me and a different kind of story. And yet, that truth that comes from having either real people or a real event, I think that raises historical fiction up to something really, really special. And even though we know that historical events are often quite controversial even now, and if you look at the sources, one source says one thing, another source says something else. So people might disagree exactly on what the real historical event actually did. And so we as historical fiction writers are interpreting the past in a certain way. And so historical fiction shouldn't be used as nonfiction. It's not the same thing. But I always hope that my fiction is used as sort of a springboard for somebody to get interested in an era or get interested in a certain topic, and then you can run off and read more about it.
That's a perfect way to end our podcast. And I'm very much a firm believer of that historical fiction and period drama on television are great portals into the past for people who may not read much nonfiction, may not have read one at all, at that particular time. And they're great ways for people to find subjects they're interested in.
Yeah, I think people shouldn't be scared of historical fiction. I think there's always that sliver of people who think, they remember the 1,000-page, books that were more common maybe in the past and had just dripping with detail about everything. I actually love those, but I understand that people are intimidated by that sometimes. But there's so much great contemporary historical fiction that's really pacey and wonderful. And so, if obviously, people who love history, are going to read probably all of it, nonfiction and fiction. I love to read both, but historical fiction, it has that sort of special character to infuse life and drama, into these past events.
Beth and I were saying just before we came on, historical fiction, you have to do just as much research as non-fiction writers, because we have what we often refer to as the well actually brigade, who every time you write something go, well actually I think you'll find blah 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 blah, and they tend to go after non-fiction writers just onto historical fiction writers and go, well clearly you don't know what you're talking about, so your research has to be just as watertight.
Yeah, I mean it is absolutely a lot of work. And, sometimes I wish I had went to university to get a degree in history. And I tell myself maybe that would have made it easier. Probably not. But as a journalist, I approach it the way I would any other kind of story as a trained journalist, and, look at the sources how I can. But with the caveat that I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to be able to have that rigorous, scholarship is definitely reserved for the academics and for the real historians. I do not claim that. I respect historians so much. I would never claim to encroach on their land. But, as a journalist and as a writer, I do my best to find all the sources I possibly can, and just submerge myself into them. And then as a fiction writer, I set it aside, sit down and write the story, because you can't, at least I can't, write a story with a bunch of notes and dates and things sitting next to me. I have it in my head at some point, and then it's gone. So it's certainly a different process, I imagine, than a historian who's writing a piece of nonfiction, for sure, because they, everything needs to be, maybe footnoted even, every piece you have to know where it comes from. And I have at least that license of imagination where, if I want to say, put something in Mussolini's mouth, I can do it, but it has to be plausible. It has to be, within what we know of Mussolini. So I have to know enough to be able to do that. And that in itself is a challenge, but I obviously love to do it because I keep writing historical fiction.
Which is fantastic. Could you just remind everyone the title of your book and when it's available, where they can get it?
Yeah, my latest book is called Sinners of Starlight City. And it came out last week, so it is brand new and fresh. And as far as I know, you can get it everywhere: Waterstones, Independence, wherever you get your books. Audiobook will be coming out in a couple of months, I think, if you are into audiobooks. Ebook is obviously already out as well. And if you check it out, I hope you enjoy it. It's such a fun book, and you will know everything you want to know about the World's Fair by the end of it.
I'll talk to the powers to see if we can get it on the online History Hack bookshop.org, so that every time we make a sale, the podcast makes a small amount of money. You get more money than if it was sold through a popular website. I'm not even going to make a rainforest joke because I made so many of those. I think their algorithms and lawyers are after me, but you know what I mean.
Great. Thank you.
And thanks for coming on to talk to us.
Oh, it was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.